discuss this history curriculum moreover and looking at exactly what impact does it have on learning, we've got in-studio Professor Amanda Esterhuizen from WITS. Professor Amanda, thanks a lot for joining us this evening on Newsnight. Now, the brilliance about this is that you're actually part of the task team that has been sent to actually take a look at this curriculum and see whether or not the history curriculum needs an actual overhaul. And you and I were speaking and having a conversation off-air about how we almost have gone back to the original curriculum just before the CAPS curriculum. What's the purpose of this?
Two back.
Just about two back, yeah.
What happened was, I think, straight after apartheid, they put in an interim curriculum. That had a few tweaks and changes to it. And, of course, people were quite bound by what existed in textbooks and things like that. Subsequent to that, they did Curriculum 2005, which was quite a big swing away from the normal curricula that we had, all done prior to that, because it wasn't sort of learning facts anymore, it was outcomes-based. But it was huge, and there was learning areas, and there was outcomes, and the teachers weren't coping. Nobody was really ready for it, I think, is what really went wrong. Also, at that particular point in time, they took out history. So they decided...
They changed the names completely during that time, so I remember.
Human and social sciences and all of those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So as we got to about 2000, Professor Kara Asmal, who was then the education minister, became quite concerned about this. And there was a push to say, look, we actually need to reinstitute history as a subject in the senior years at least, and also start rethinking about how we're teaching history. And he put together a panel then, who then created and worked with curriculum materials and teachers and all the rest of it to try and construct a curriculum which was very much about our heritage, about what it meant to be African, all of those kinds of things, and of course the more recent histories. But what happened subsequent to that is then it got cut because it was still too big, and then in CAPS they cut out even more because teachers weren't coping, and they actually swung back again to more factual-based history. So we're almost back to where the interim curriculum was. Yeah. And in doing so, unfortunately for someone like myself, who's an archaeologist, they actually took out a lot of the deeper history, which for me is African
who we are,
history.
And it's African history. Yeah. And I was saying to you off air that this is a conversation that I love having, and it's been it just makes me so mad that kids and African kids, black kids, don't know to the full extent that their history, their ancestors actually contributed to a more civilized South Africa. And I'm going to use a perfect example of Mapungubwe. Mapungubwe is still a tale that has not, or a historical fact that has not been articulated in schools till today. Many kids don't know I only found out about Mapungubwe when I was well into my adulthood. So how many kids know that in the Limpopo province they lived a civilized nation, and people that used to trade with the Roman Empire, and people that used to go into the full smelting of gold and copper, etc., just for understanding just the impact that African history has on civilization, and that civilization in South Africa is not Eurocentric.
I think, you're absolutely right. And Mapungubwe is in the curriculum at the moment, but at a junior year. Yeah. And unfortunately that when it's done in the junior years, it's not really taken seriously. And it's done at a level which is very superficial. So people get an idea, yes, there's some archaeology, and they found this, and maybe they found some gold, and there was a skeleton maybe, those kinds of things.
But they don't say that the University of Pretoria, for example, hid the artifacts, and that the reason for hiding the artifacts
of it, and how history is constructed. Yeah. And I think that's what's missing, and what we're trying to do, I think, with changing the curriculum, is to try and get people to think differently about Africa. And it's what you're talking about. It's trying to get people to engage with the fact that actually African history is complex. Yeah. It's not simple. Yeah. It's not a simple to complex, and complex came with colonialism, not by any means. It is very complex.
Or that architecture in South Africa came with colonization, and that colonization, or even the apartheid system, brought about a more global approach to how we do things in this country, because it's false. It's not only false for the South African story, it's false for the African story as a whole. Yeah.
And people need to know that there was global trade going on
way before, in 1300
AD,
thank you.
Even earlier. So, we've got these links, these very early global trade with the East Coast, with India, with China at various points in time, with the Middle East at various points in time. And, we can track all of that complexity. The other thing that I think is somewhat got lost in the history curriculum is the fact that we've got so much evidence these days, and there's so much new technology which gives us different ways of looking at the past. So we can see landscapes completely differently from what we could even 10 years ago. And you're talking about architecture and things like that. You know, we've got these early Tswana cities which are alluded to in, say, Moffat. And people think, oh yes, Iron Age, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
We're talking about peri-urban cities. These are large-scale cities. And when you can see them on the landscape, you can see exactly how big and what the impact of these cities must have been on the landscape. And
but
then
just how civilized as well, though, Professor. It's also about just this, and perhaps the conversation also is about African pride. You know, the narrative is that Africa is a dark continent and that there's poverty in Africa, and yes, there's poverty in Africa. Yes, there are huge inequalities in Africa, but perhaps brought about by the colonial era, which took away the African pride, in the aim of instilling that African pride back into the African child. Maybe they'll see just how much was contributed just by their Africanness. My question then is, why now?
Yes. I think it was there in 2000. I think it's been lost. And now I think there's actually an intention to say, look, you know, really it's time.
Yeah.
Also what's happening is the interest in history is falling off. And, you know, I read a lot of the, obviously, the report went out and there was a huge amount of public response to it. And the public response has been disappointing in many respects as well.
Are people not as open to it?
Well, on the one hand, you know, they say, oh, well, this is just going to be ANC history. So this is, you're going to be learn how to be, you know, it's going to be propaganda, which it's not at all. I mean, there's a lot of things that have got to be addressed by it. But there also, there's no recognition of the value of history, of knowing history, so that it makes the student a critical thinking person. There's nothing of that that people are thinking about. They always say, well, why don't you teach them economics? Why not maths? Those kinds of things. Well, actually, economics depends on history. You can't do economics. You can't understand sustainability, risks, how many risks African societies took, how they moved, where they went, when climate changed, if there was a black swan event. These are all things that you learn through history.
But if a person does not know where they come from, how are they supposed to determine where they're going anyways, right? So you have to know where we're going, where we come from in order for you to go. So when you're talking about the public response to it and that people are not as yet caught into it, what is the response from an educational perspective? In other words, from the teachers. Are they able now, because you're saying earlier on that the teachers, it was just too much for the teachers during the curriculum and the previous curriculum as well. What has been the response from a teaching level? Because ultimately, the people that have to teach this history are the educators themselves.
There's been a huge positive response from the educators themselves and the teachers. That's been interesting. I mean, obviously they recognize that it's going to change again and that's going to be more changes and things like that for them. But overwhelmingly, I think teachers want to grapple with histories and local histories again. You know, that was taken out with CAPS. So, for example, if you follow the curriculum, it goes up from the Cape, it's very Cape-centered, and then it sort of stops somewhere around Gauteng, and Limpopo loses out completely.
Yeah.
And yet Limpopo, as you say, Mapungubwe, but it's not only Mapungubwe. There's fantastic history. And history of people pushing back. So you have groups in that area, including the Afrikaner, fighting against each other, but they actually oust the Afrikaner. So, and we don't know that. You don't hear about the agency of various individuals, of chiefs, Mankopani, Makopani, Sekwati, all of those players, those political players, who actually took control of their land again. Why don't we know that? And wouldn't that make a difference to you if you did know that?
Well, in a closing statement, as we wrap this conversation up, as I was reading one of the history articles about, you know, historical artifacts and history in South Africa, they say that sometimes the reason why history was hidden so that the very same individuals that were affected by it don't know just how much of an impact they have on history itself. So when you keep the truth hidden from people, they don't know the value that they bring. So hopefully you can change that.
I hope so.
Thank you so much for joining us, Professor, this evening. They're speaking to Professor Amanda Esterhuizen, who's also part of the task team when it comes to overhauling the history curriculum, a conversation that indeed does continue.